Hello everyone, Kato here. Welcome back to my series on the Treaty of Versailles. Today we'll be going over the events leading up to Japan's declaration of war on Germany in 1914. Before we get into the video, please push that like button down below. It's free and it really helps the channel out. Without further ado, let's get into it. The Japanese delegation at the Versailles Conference had three primary goals. They aimed to increase the size of their empire by annexing German islands in the Pacific Ocean, to secure and expand their sphere of influence in China, and to achieve recognition by the Europeans as a great power of equal standing. In the hundreds of years that followed the discovery of America by Christopher Columbus, the Europeans had spread across the planet, trading, preaching, settling, and conquering. For most of this period, Japan was largely shut off to the outside world. While they'd initially appreciated the goods that the Europeans brought into their markets, they were weary of their intentions and disliked the proselytizing of European religious figures. For over 200 years, Japan existed in isolation from the rest of the world. That period was ended abruptly with the arrival of an American naval detachment under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853. He sought to gain Japan's agreement to protect and aid American sailors lost at sea and to open up their ports, both to technical support for damaged ships as well as American goods. Seeing the size of his ships and its guns, the Japanese had no recourse but to agree to America's terms. Viewing this as an opening, the British, French, Russians, and a number of other European powers imposed similar treaties on Japan that were beneficial to themselves. The Japanese chafed under these unequal treaties, but had to accept it because during their centuries of isolation, they'd been left behind technologically. They had also seen the Mughal Empire colonized by the British and how successive European nations had defeated the Qing dynasty and broken China up into spheres of influence. They were determined to modernize in an effort to avoid the fates of India and China, and more than anything, they wanted to claim for themselves a place in the sun. This period was known as the Meiji Restoration, named for the reigning emperor from 1867 to 1912. The Japanese sent out diplomats to Europe and America to study their system of government, science, technology, infrastructure, legal systems, and arts. They established a school system with compulsory education up to the 6th grade so that every citizen of Japan could read, write, had a basic understanding of math and science, and knew a bit of history. Military advisors were brought in from the West to organize their armed services upon European lines and equip them with modern armaments. They built roads, railway systems, ports, and telegraph lines in an effort to unify the country and bring people from all over Japan into contact with each other. They were aided in this by a culture that emphasized the importance of education, discipline, and patriotism. The motto of the Meiji Restoration was Fukoku Kyohei, enrich the country, strengthen the armed forces, and it was done. Within 50 years, Japan went from being a feudal society to a modern industrial power. They began to assert themselves in their region. First, they invaded and annexed nearby Ryukyu Kingdom, a small kingdom to the south of the main Japanese islands, inhabited by a related Japanese ethnic group that became Okinawa Prefecture. In 1895, they crushed the Qing dynasty in the First Sino-Japanese War and colonized Taiwan. Japan was then faced with a much more fearsome opponent, Russia. The two nations had a competing interest in Manchuria. On February the 8th of 1904, Japan launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at anchor at Port Arthur. The war lasted for over a year and a half, and the Japanese took heavy casualties, but they managed to achieve a hard-fought victory, symbolized by their triumph at Tsushima, where a Russian fleet sailed halfway across the world to be sunk by the modernized Japanese Navy, under the command of Admiral Togo Heihachiro. The defeat of a European power by a modernized Asian one stunned the world. The peace conference was hosted by President Theodore Roosevelt at Portsmouth. Japan received Sakhalin, but the Russians refused to pay reparations and threatened to resume the war if the Japanese delegation proved obstinate. Japan had achieved a string of military victories, but at great economic cost, and the Russians were convinced that they wouldn't have the resources to continue to prosecute the war. That, along with increased American pressure, convinced the Japanese envoys to accept these terms. The treaty was not well received by the Japanese populace, though, who felt that they'd shown shameful weakness in the face of the Europeans. In 1910, they renewed their expansion by annexing the Korean peninsula. In 1902, Japan signed an alliance with Britain. It was of great significance to both powers, firstly because Britain had adopted a policy of splendid isolation after Napoleon's defeat in 1815. They rejected entangling continental alliances and focused primarily on building and maintaining their colonial empire. Forming an alliance with Japan was a major break from what had been Britain's foreign policy for the better part of a century. On Japan's part, Britain agreeing to an alliance with them was a sign of respect, and to many Japanese politicians and media figures, a sign that the Europeans were beginning to see Japan as an equal. So that was part 1 of the Japanese chapter of this series. Part 2 will be coming within the next 2 to 3 days. I'll talk about Japan's role in the Great War, their participation at Versailles, and its effects on Japanese foreign policy during the interwar period. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this content, please like the video, share, comment, and subscribe. Have a nice day. Peace.